Good afternoon or good morning. I hope you can hear me. I hope you can see me. We're in the height of summer, and here in the UK, it's pouring with rain. So a traditional British summer there. Welcome to Bradbury 100 Live. This is my second attempt to do one of these. I did one about a year ago. And this is really to commemorate the end of the centenary year of Ray Bradbury. He would have been 101 years old tomorrow. So this is the last day of the year that we can call the centenary year. And then we'll have to call it the 101st celebratory year, or whatever we want to call it. So just to commemorate the end of that year, to bring it to a close, I thought I'd do a live show again. And I'm joined today by really clever interwebs, by Steven Paul Leiva, who was the first guest on the audio podcast of Bradbury 100. Steve, can you hear me?
Proud to be so.
Fantastic. So Steve's going to be telling us something of his experiences with Ray, and we'll come to that in a short while. I've also got some photos to share with you, some video footage from Ray Bradbury's 90th birthday party. So that would have been about 11 years ago. So I've got some material from that. And we're also going to talk about, well, some projects that Ray was involved with, even though those projects may or may not have come to fruition. That all sounds a bit mysterious, but we'll come to that in a while. So before we talk to Steve, well, let me just show you one of the things that Steven Paul Leiva is known for. This is my favorite of his works, is a short little book called Searching for Ray Bradbury, which was put out during Ray's 90th birthday year, I think. Is that right, Steve?
No, it came out later than that. It came out after his death, I believe.
Oh, right, okay.
There's a collection of different things I wrote about Ray.
Okay, but many of them were during that year, weren't they? During, or at least...
Well, yeah, there's one essay that talks about Ray Bradbury Week, which I created to celebrate his 90th birthday. And but also the memorial piece I wrote about him for the Science Fiction Writers magazine.
Of course, yeah. So we'll talk some more to Steve in a while about some of the projects that he was involved with. And there's also the possibility of other people joining us in the discussion. This is a Zoom meeting. I've published the link to it in the Facebook event. So if anyone wants to talk to us or ask us any questions, please join the Zoom meeting. If you do that, you'll go into a waiting room first of all, and then I'll admit you when I get the opportunity to do that. You can also post questions and comments on the Facebook page itself, either in the Ray Bradbury fan club or the Bradbury 100 page. Trouble is, I'm sort of operating mission control here. I've got so many devices, I will probably miss anything that is texted as a post. So if we don't actually address any questions that come up, I apologize in advance. The one other thing to say is this is being recorded. So this is, although it's a live event, it will stay on Facebook, and I will actually put a better quality recording of it onto my website after the event, although it'll take me a few days to get around to doing that. Now, one of the things that I wanted to talk about today was something that happened when Ray was 90 years old. He had a public birthday party in a bookshop in California, in Gelndale, and I attended, and these are some of my photos from around the time of that event. These were actually the day before, shots of me in Ray's den in his house, and then shots from the bookshop, which Steve was telling me earlier on I think is now a cake shop, and the bookshop closed down, unfortunately. Carried on as a mail order business, I believe. Yes. This was Ray's 90th birthday cake, which is the only cake I've ever seen with a bibliography. It's in the form of a burning book, and it's got a list of Ray's books sort of emblazoned on the top of the book there. But it was a genuine cake, and it was eaten. There was nothing left but crumbs at the end of the day. 90th birthday card inspired by a Bradbury story, A Sound of Thunder. See the dinosaur and the butterfly. And some shots of the bookshop. This is before Ray arrived, and it was already pretty full. All the aisles of the bookshop quite full. Some famous people there. This is George Clayton Johnson, co-author of Logan's Run, creator of Ocean's 11, writer of the first Star Trek episode that went to air. In this shot, there's various people, but the man with his hand out on the left there is William F. Nolan, who died recently, the other co-author of Logan's Run. And this is Ray being whisked away in his limo after the event. Now, a lot of people didn't see Ray driving away because they didn't know they could get out the back of the bookshop. On the walls of that bookshop, there's signatures of all people who've signed books there. So this is a doodle that Ray did. This is Stephen Gallagher, the British horror novelist. I can't remember which other ones come up in these photos. Kim Newman, another British author. I must have been drawn to the British authors that I'd seen on the walls there. And then there's one coming up next, which Steve may recognize. Oh, no, not just yet. This is Sam Weller, the biographer of Ray. So he obviously had a signing session for the Bradbury Chronicles at some point. And hey, Steven Paul Leiva found his own signature on the wall from an earlier book signing.
Indeed.
So, Steve, you were there. You were sort of master of ceremonies for that.
Yeah, I was in one of those pictures. I'm holding, I think, a bunch of dandelions that somebody handed to me or wanted to hand to Ray, and I took. Yeah, I didn't organize that birthday party, but I was involved in it. And that happened, I think, the Saturday before the week started. Now, possibly the Friday, the day before, or maybe it was on Monday. I think it was on Monday, but we had a day at the LA City Council when in the big hall there in the LA City Council room, where they officially declared the coming week to be Ray Bradbury Week.
Mm-hmm.
I conceived the idea and organized, and I can tell you the genesis of that if you want. But that was a rather amazing event. And I have a Facebook page, Ray Bradbury Week, on the Facebook page, and there's video of that whole event. And the current mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, was the president of the city council at the time. And through his office, I was able to arrange Ray Bradbury Week, and I organized a whole series of events for that whole week, including a screening of Fahrenheit 451 at the Writers Guild Theater, which was sponsored by Hugh Hefner and the Playboy Foundation, because Playboy was, as you well know, Phil, was a big part of Ray's life, maybe Ray's wife, I don't know.
Freudian slip.
Maybe she was a centerfold at one point. We don't know. But we also did. I directed a staged reading of The Better Part of Wisdom, which is one of my favorite Ray Bradbury stories and short plays. And that was at the actual Writers Guild headquarters, and I had the great James Cromwell in it, as well as Seamus Dever, if you're a fan of Castle, who played Lieutenant Ryan on Castle. And we screened Wonderful Ice Cream Suit at the Central Library in downtown LA, which was a big part of Ray's life. And we had Joe Mantegna there, who was the star of it, and Stuart Gordon, the director, and we did a panel there. And so Ray came out to almost every event that we had, which tired him greatly, I'm afraid to say. But nonetheless, his daughter Z reported to me that he was thrilled with the whole week. Yeah.
On my Bradbury 100 episode this week, I interviewed myself, and I talked about the 90th birthday party, which we've just seen the photos from, and I saw Ray the day before and the day after, as well as on the day of that party, and he was exhausted. There's no question about it. But when I suggested to him that maybe it had been a bit too much, he wouldn't have any of that. No, it was very important that he go to these events, and he loved every minute. Is what he
did, and I was, as I got the permission from him and the family to do this, the one proviso was, in any advertising, I say that Mr. Bradbury hopes to attend every event, but we cannot guarantee it, because he would often want to go to an event and just couldn't get himself up to go at the last moment. And of course, this would disappoint people. So we wanted to give a warning. But I think he came to every event except there was a private school that did a children's version of Fahrenheit 451, and at not the Television Academy, but the Paley Center for Media, we ran some of his TV adaptations. And he that was the last Saturday, that was the last event, and he couldn't make that. But we ran about 4 different things, including, I think, the version of The Electric Grandmother that he liked the best. Or was it always called that, The Electric Grandmother? Or
yeah, the TV version.
It was an hour version instead of that Twilight Zone version.
Yeah, that's right. So the story is I Sing the Body Electric.
Yeah.
But the TV version was The Electric Grandmother. Yeah.
Yeah. And he preferred that over the Twilight Zone half hour that was made with.
Yeah, he had a thing about the Twilight Zone episode as having been mangled and having crucial parts cut away. But I've read the script and it's not much different from what he wrote. So I think there was a bit of it was more the friction between him and Rod Serling that had upset him, I think.
Which is sad, but we got to admit that Twilight Zone was certainly inspired by the tone of a lot of Ray's stories, which I was a big fan of Twilight Zone, still am, was quite inspired by it, but I didn't know that until I read Ray later in my life.
Yeah.
That some of that tone was coming from there. Nonetheless, they're wonderful little productions, especially the half-hour ones.
Absolutely. Now, I've got some video footage as well from that 90th birthday party. And now I have literally never shown this ever. Some of the photos I've published before, but I've never shown this video before. And to be honest, I'd forgotten that I had it. And it was only a few weeks ago when I was rummaging through some old computer files that I found these video files there. Now, when I found them, I knew that I had shot them, but I had forgotten that they existed. But I've clipped them all together, so I can run this for you now. So this will give you a sense of what it was like to go and get a book signed by Ray Bradbury. So this is the bookshop being set up ahead of time.
Now that gentleman that you saw was John King Tarpinian.
That's right.
A very good friend to Ray towards his last years, and was just there, drove him places, took care of him when he was out, was always with him. Very, very shy man himself, didn't want to ever be in the limelight, but just so dear to Ray at the end.
Absolutely.
It was he worked for the IRS, so you can call the inland revenue.
Yeah. Now this is, I imagine this is the moment that Ray arrived in the bookshop, and you can see, you can't see anything. There's such a crowd there. Some people climbed up on step ladders that they found lying around the bookshop to get a decent shot. And I realized that I paid the price for coming early because I was at the back of the shop and the sign was taking place at the front. So, but here you get a glimpse of Ray. So this is 90-year-old Ray Bradbury greeting his fans. And there's Steve in the background there. It was difficult to get any footage of Ray. I soon realized that the only way to actually get any would be to join the queue, take a book, and get myself filmed while he was signing the book. So that's what I did. I didn't actually need any books, but some other people I was with did. So I got some of their books signed. So this is me. And I remember saying to Ray, "Hello, do you remember me from yesterday?" But he couldn't hear a thing. It was too noisy in there. So I don't think he really twigged who I was.
Pretty deaf at the time.
Yeah.
And did not see very well.
Yeah. But he was as sharp as a tack.
Can we put it that way? He felt the crowd, certainly.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And it sort of seemed to me, it's a bit like meeting the Pope. I mean, I've never met the Pope, but the way people would sort of, it's like making a pilgrimage. I mean, watch what happens here. So he signs the book. He always uses these Sharpie pens, so he leaves a nice thick signature that bleeds through the page. And then look, he blesses you.
You know what he would always say?
No?
Almost everybody would come up and say, your books mean so much to me. They changed my life. You're the best writer. And he would always say, you have wonderful taste.
Ah.
Yeah, at this point, he wasn't shy. He knew what he had accomplished, and he was proud of it, and rightly so.
Absolutely. This is George Clayton Johnson again. Very talented writer. Just coming in on the side here, reaching across to Ray, is Mark Scott Zicree, the author of the Twilight Zone Companion. And there were quite a few sort of public figures present, and indeed there were some people I didn't even know who they were, and afterwards somebody said to me, oh, do you know who that was? So, you know, there were some sort of famous people there.
I just realized that there's the butterfly lady. I just realized that that dandelion thing is actually a mic.
It is, yeah.
See, I was inside. I didn't even realize all these people had been outside.
Yeah. This on the right there is William F. Nolan again. I think on the left is Arnold Kunert, who was Ray Harryhausen's agent. And this is
looking at the.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's when I was there. I did a reading of my novel Blood is Pretty.
Yeah. And then at the end, final photo shoot outside. And then I haven't got the sound on this, but Ray, after the photo, cries out, "It's Miller time." And then more people come in for handshakes and photos and what have you. So that's my little finding of video material that I'd forgotten existed. So it was nice to stumble upon that.
Again, if people want on the Ray Bradbury Week thing, you'll find videos of not only that city council, but of the Playboy, Hugh Hefner and Ray on stage together, talking about Fahrenheit 451, and also some poorly shot, but a few clips of the Better Part of Wisdom reading. We couldn't do the whole thing for rights purposes, and it wasn't a professional recording. A friend of mine just in the audience recorded some, and it's dark, but still it gives you some feel of what went on.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's well worth a look, and I've recommended that before. So it's on Facebook. It's called Ray Bradbury Week. Ray Bradbury 2010.
2010.
Yeah. So it's very easy to find. There's a load of material. You can spend hours on there. I went on there again yesterday and was blown away by the quantity of material on there. It's really fantastic. One of the things that I wanted to talk about today is a project that Ray worked on and that Steven Paul Leiva worked on, which was Little Nemo in Slumberland. So I've prepared a little piece of video to sort of explain what it was originally for people who don't know. I mean, I think it's quite a famous cartoon strip, but it was written and drawn by Winsor McKay, who was a very talented cartoonist, and he was also an animator. He was involved.
He was one of the first animators that really was an illustrative animator. He helped create the whole art form. Yeah,
he did. Yeah. So this was his comic strip. I do believe this is the very first issue of the comic strip. And Little Nemo is basically this little boy who goes to bed every night, finds himself. In this instance, he's invited to Slumberland by, I think, Morpheus, the king of Slumberland or something like that. And he rides off on this horse, races against a green kangaroo for some reason. The horse trips over a star. He falls and falls and falls and falls. And then, boom, he lands and awakens, because of course it's all a dream. And that's basically the gist of Little Nemo. And I haven't seen all of the strips in the series, but the ones I've seen, that's pretty much it. He goes to bed, he wakes up with a jolt at the end. And there's not much.
It's pretty surreal.
Yeah.
Uh,
These are a couple of photos that Steve sent me. Who's this, Stephen?
well, that's my wife. Well, she was my assistant at the time, but we were engaged, and that's Ray. And it was a party. It was a co-production with a Japanese company called TMS, Tokyo Movie Shinsha, with Gary Kurtz's company. Gary had produced American Graffiti and Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back, and I was working for him, and I was associate producer on it. That's Gary at the end of the table. Ray, you can see, he may be hidden by the little thumbnails of our pictures there.
Oh, yeah.
That was at a story conference. I'm next to Ray. That's the back of my head. And then there's the man with a lot of hair is Takahata. He's a very famous Japanese animator and was Miyazaki's partner. And Miyazaki, if people know who Miyazaki is, was the Japanese co-director. I had hired an American co-director named Andy Gasco, who was actually half Japanese. His mother was Japanese. His parents met after the war. His dad had been on Douglas MacArthur's staff, I believe. And then the other gentleman was Fujioka, the head of TMS.
Now, of course, the film, as it would have been produced by Gary Kurtz and written by Ray, didn't happen.
That's correct.
But eventually a film did come out. So this is sort of it's not the same film, but it's a kind of the offspring of that original project.
It was still Tokyo Movie Shinsha.
Yeah.
And did they have Ray? Yeah. See, Ray hated that credit because it was not the film. It was not the film that he had hoped for.
Yeah.
But that it was sort of a bad situation, because you can tell from just looking at the one Little Nemo strip, and we always called it Nemo, which quite frankly was my suggestion, because we were trying to do something that wasn't going to be a little kiddie film. And I thought Little Nemo in Slumberland, just Nemo. We were trying to do something that would be broader than that. But Little Nemo in Slumberland, the strip never had any story, of course. It was just these surreal images, because Winsor McCay was obviously a brilliant draftsman and an artist. And we had a very hard time trying to get to a story. Now, you want to know about Ray's involvement and how it started?
Yeah.
It originally started with Chuck Jones, who, of course, was a Looney Tunes director, created the Roadrunner and the Coyote. In 78 or 79, it was possibly 79 or late 78. The people, Fujioka-san, came to Chuck Jones with this idea. He had gotten the international rights to Little Nemo in Slumberland. I think it was PD in America, but internationally, there were rights still out there. And he wanted to make a film of it. He wanted it to be an American-Japanese co-production, and he wanted to use the American technique of animation, character animation. He wanted to bring that to Japan. Now, Japanese anime obviously is brilliant in Japan. In fact, anime films often make more money than live action films in Japan. And of course, Miyazaki has become a huge artist in Japan in the films that he did after what we did all here. But he wanted to do it in Japan. They animate and then they add the voice track. In American animation, of course, you animate to the voice track.
Yes.
And we're more concerned in the performance art of animation. The Japanese, obviously, they move their characters, but they're more interested in kind of the art drawing of it all. So the twain wasn't going to meet in these two things, but Chuck was interested, and Fujioka asked, who do you think would be good to write this? And he said, well, it would have to be Ray Bradbury. So at the time, back at that time, I was doing publicity for animation studios, and Chuck had given me actually office space in his little studio there in Hollywood. And he asked me to take Fujioka and his translator to Ray Bradbury's office in Beverly Hills. And I had met Ray earlier because he was such a fan of animation, and I had been executive secretary of an animators organization, and so we met at various times. So I took him to meet Ray. We had a nice meeting. This was in his Beverly Hills office with all the toys and the dinosaurs and everything. It was quite a wonderland. And then that's the last I heard of it. It never went anywhere, as far as I know. Chuck never got involved. But later, I got involved with Gary Kurtz by selling him a project to do an animated feature film based on Will Eisner's The Spirit. And I was doing that for a very young Brad Bird, who no one had heard of at the time, but I had met him. I had seen a mock trailer for the film he had put together with other graduates from Cal Arts and Disney animators. And Gary, it turned out, was a huge comic book collector. In fact, he had a fireproof safe for his comics collection up in the Marin County area above San Francisco. And Gary tasked me to secure the rights from Will Eisner, and we got that. And then a couple of years after we were into that, he asked me to actually join his company because he had a project with the Japanese. I said, well, what is it? And he says, well, we're going to make a film based on Little Nemo in Slumberland. I said, is this Fujioka DMS? He said, yeah. And I guess Chuck, when Chuck had turned it down, they went to George Lucas. George Lucas wasn't interested, but said, you should contact Gary Kurtz. And so they made a deal, and we started to put together a production. And for 1 year, we were trying to develop it in an office I set up in Hollywood. And again, Hayao Miyazaki was going to be the American co-director. His most famous feature at that time, the first one, was the Lupin 3 feature. And I had hired Andy Gaskell, who later went on to be art director of The Lion King. And then some directing animators. One was Roger Allers, who went on to co-write and co-direct The Lion King, plus co-write the Broadway version. And several other animators. Randy Cartwright, who later became a big guy at Disney as well. And we tried to develop it for a year, and that's when Ray was involved. And Gary loved Ray Bradbury too. So yeah, let's have Ray. So he was contracted to do the screenplay. So Ray would come into the office to have story meetings. And that picture was obviously from a time when Gary Kurtz was there. Now, Gary was currently also producing Return to Oz in England.
Oh, yes.
Yes. So his time was a bit divided. I was basically head of the American team and had the office there in Hollywood. And we brought in a whole bunch of Japanese artists, and we were all doing inspirational art. That's what they were doing at first. And Ray started to write. He loved the artwork, especially Chris Lane. We showed this book briefly. This book later with Chris Lane he did, because he loved Chris's artwork. Do you have anything? Things like that there is the way Chris would draw.
Yeah.
And but there was other, Robin Budd from Canada had some great artwork. And then the Japanese were producing wonderful things. And I think Ray came up with the idea that somehow the World's Fair would be involved, because you know how Ray loved World's Fairs. And he came up with the idea of an opposite to Nemo named Omen, which is Nemo spelled backwards, of course. And it was very much in line. And my wife, Amanda, whose picture you saw, pointed out that it was very much like the light and dark boys in both Something Wicked This Way Comes. And is it even in Dandelion Wine? Is there a slightly darker friend?
Yeah.
So he always sort of had that that feel about things. But when he started turning in pages, we all had to scratch our head, because there was no continuity. They were scenes. And I don't really remember them very well, except one had something to do with a giant spider they used as an elevator down a cavern. That's all I remember. And after quite a while, the Japanese came to me, because again, I was the one always on site, except when Gary visited. And they said, we just don't understand what Mr. Bradbury is doing. We can't work with any of this. There's nothing to work with. So dutifully, I reported that to Gary Kurtz, and Gary took, I thought at the time, took Ray off the production. And then we went forward to try to do something here. And the problem was Miyazaki was also a problem, because he really wanted to run the show himself, and this was a co-production. And he was trying to make a film that had nothing to do with Nemo. We were still trying to be true to Winsor McKay's strip. So Miyazaki left before we moved the whole production to Japan. Miyazaki, of course, went and created Studio Ghibli, and the rest is history on that end.
I was going to say, and he was never heard from again.
Yeah, he was never heard of again. He was so shamed. No, he hated us, I think, and I think he's quoted somewhere as saying it was the worst, most miserable time in his professional career. And I don't blame him for saying that, because I'm sure it was, because he didn't understand what we were trying to do, and he didn't want to do the American style of animation at all. And why should he, to be honest with you? The Japanese animation is very successful in its own right. I'm a big fan, and I remain a fan of Miyazaki's. I think I have every one of his films, my whole family, and he's brilliant, and far more brilliant, I think, than some American animators, to be honest with you. But anyways, we all packed up and moved to Japan, and I left after a year in Japan because I could see it was going nowhere. And so, and I actually worked for Gary. I didn't work for the co-production. So my contract was up with Gary. I came home. I married Amanda during the New Year's break. She stopped being my assistant at that time, and we just lived in Tokyo for a while, and then came home. Years and years later, and then eventually that film was made. In fact, it was directed by an old friend of mine, Bill Kurtz, who spent most of his career doing commercials for Jay Ward, who created Rocky and Bullwinkle. Wow. Bill Kurtz had done Captain Crunch commercials. I don't know if you ever had the Captain Crunch cereal in England, but
I don't think so, but I've seen the commercials.
Yeah, so, you know, and June Foray was always the little girl in that. June Foray was Rocky the Flying Squirrel, the voice of. But years later, Ray calls me, and he said, "Do you have the Little Nemo script I wrote?" And I said, "No, I didn't even know you finished one." He said, "I did, and I can't find the last page. I found it in my files, but I can't, and I'm thinking of publishing it." Now, oddly enough, although I don't think he remembered it, he got it from my wife, Amanda, because Ray had, and that's a story we don't need to go into, but he had generously offered to give me a blurb for my first novel, Blood is Pretty, that was published. And in some letters back and forth and talking to and emails with Ray, I think Amanda had put out there, maybe even after, before this, she said, "Gee, if there's a script, maybe you can publish that, and it would be great if you could get some of those illustrations from Chris Lane and what have you." And then, but this was even later than that, after that. So I said, "I'm sorry, and I'll contact Gary Kurtz and try to find out if he has it." And when I contact Gary Kurtz, oddly, Gary said, "Well, you know, I was thinking the same thing. Maybe we could publish that." But that never went anywhere. And eventually we couldn't find it. And then quite a few years later, the book that you're showing there was published. I guess Ray found the last page.
Yeah, or somebody did.
Yeah, or somebody did. I don't know where he got it from. I was surprised when this book was coming out. I immediately bought it because I'd never read it. Now, that scene I'm talking about with the spider is not in there. It's nothing like the pages he was sending. And I asked Gary once about why it happened that way. And Gary said, "Well, I asked him to be like an inspirational artist with words," which quite frankly was the stupidest thing I think he ever did. Because inspirational art in animation is great. You have story things and you can be inspired by art, but to do Airden kind of scenes, I don't think it was the best direction ever given to Ray before.
It's funny you should say that, because for some time, and I think it was before Nemo, he had been paid to do inspirational writing for John Jurdy Associates, which was an architectural firm.
Yes, yeah.
So he wrote a series of essays about shopping malls and things like that, and they're just sort of poetic think pieces, really.
Well, that I can see that relating.
Yeah.
But for a film, you need a story structure.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And so this screenplay, which is very close to Winsor McCay, and I'm not quite frankly convinced that it actually would have made a very good film. I don't know.
I have to admit, I haven't read this book. I've had this since it was published, and I've started it a few times, but I haven't got very far with it. There's one curious thing about it. I do believe this book. So this is called Nemo.
Yeah. Because that's what we called the film.
Because that's what the film was, and it's the cover art isn't Winsor McCay.
No, they probably,
which I don't understand, because Winsor McCay's stuff would have been out of copyright by then. Yeah. So why they didn't just stick some up?
This was some small press.
Yeah, subterranean press. Yeah.
No idea who they are.
This is a bit sad, really. This is the first book that was published after Ray died. So you see the copyright notice. It's not copyright Ray Bradbury, it's copyright the estate of Ray Bradbury. And this is the first book that had that as a copyright statement. So it's a bit sad, really. But as a book, I think it's a disappointing presentation, because they could so easily have put some illustrated material in there that would have cost nothing.
Yeah, and I don't know where the original Chris Lane or Robin Budd illustrations or any of that stuff, but then a lot of them wouldn't really equate with what Ray finally did in the screenplay. So obviously what happened is Gary Kurtz kept Ray on. He was paying for him, I think. Well, actually the Japanese were paying for him in the final analysis, because they reimbursed Kurtz, and just had finished the screenplay, but he never showed it to us. We never even knew. As far as we knew, Ray was just off the production. We went off to Tokyo. Wow. And we were still trying to cobble together a story, which just wasn't happening because the Japanese and American story sense was different. How they later got Chris Columbus involved. And even when I was there, they were bringing in Mobius, and Gary brought in a friend named Ed Summer, who thought he was going to solve all the problems. Ed is no longer with us, unfortunately. Everybody thought they were going to solve this problem, and it wasn't going to be solved unless one person was really at the head of the thing. And while we were there, it was a duopoly, and everybody had to agree to everything. And film can't really be a democracy.
Yeah.
Somebody had to call the shots, and there was no one really to call the shots on this.
Yeah.
Now, eventually, they obviously got something. I'm not a big fan of what they eventually did, except the opening scene is a bit of film that I forced into production. So at least, although despite the fact my contract said I would get credit on any final film, they didn't give me credit, because obviously my name didn't carry the weight of Ray's. But Ray hated the fact that they put his credit on there. He was absolutely livid.
It's got to be one of the great disappointments of all time, because when you look at the names on that poster, you see Chris Columbus, who at that time had done Gremlins, and I think he was just about to go into Home Alone. So his career was really rocketing at that point in time. As you say, Mobius is named. He's named on the. I think he's credited with the story. You've on the voice front, you've got Mickey Rooney and René Auberjonois. They're the only two voice artists.
Mickey Rooney did Flip. You know who we wanted to do Flip? The Americans were pushing for, and I was actually in negotiations with his people, was Tom Waits.
Oh, wow.
You see, that's the difference.
Yeah.
The Americans were really pushing to really do something innovative and fun, and Tom Waits would have been brilliant as Flip. They get Mickey Rooney. Now, I was a huge fan of Mickey Rooney's, but and they went traditional sort of way, and it's a kiddie film.
Yeah.
And it's not what we were hoping for, but I think it's impossible to do a decent film based on Little Nemo in Slumberland, because no real story. The kid goes to bed at night, has a nightmare, and wakes up,
Yeah.
falls out of bed.
Yeah. What it would have been ideal for is little 5-minute TV episodes or 3-minute TV episodes. Would have been perfect for that,
You
because
animate, yeah.
that repetition, you know, the same basic structure every time would really work for that.
But we also had great illustrations of this World's Fair, and the World's Fair idea. If you read the screenplay, that's still there, and the Omen character is there. That was Ray's character, so there was an idea there. But part of the thing again is Gary Kurtz, who was a great man, and I loved him, to be honest with you, but he was sort of had other things on his mind with Return to Oz and things in his personal life. So he wasn't, and it was my first job as a producer, and I, didn't have a lot of power. I just had to be the bad news guy going back and forth, Gary and the Japanese, and my Japanese or my American animators. And, but it's still, we had a wonderful time. We loved living in Tokyo. And one of the great guy on the production was Otsuka, who was one of the grandparents or fathers of Japanese animation. And he just passed away earlier this year. He really wanted Japanese animation to adapt the American form of animating after the voice track. But most of the Japanese animators resisted that. And I think only one Japanese film, I think Akira, was made to a voice track. You'd have to double check me on that. But Ray had a lot of disappointments in Hollywood. This is one of the sad parts of Ray's story, and he loved Hollywood so dearly and film.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. He worked on many film projects, and some projects he returned to again and again, especially his own books. He did probably 5 or 6 different script versions of the Martian Chronicles. He did several plays based on Dandelion Wine, but although I don't think he ever did any film scripts for that. And Something Wicked This Way Comes started as a film script and then became a novel and then became a film script again.
For Gene Kelly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Gene Kelly couldn't get it produced. The thing is about the odd thing about Ray is he was very influenced by other arts, especially illustration. He loved illustration. Of course, obviously, everybody knows that he was so turned on by the Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers Sunday comic strips, and later got to know Bernarda Berenson, the great art critic who taught him so much about art. But he loved illustrations, Doye and what have you. He loved Shakespeare. He loved music, and he wanted to be he really wanted to be an actor too. And he loved film, as you've mentioned before. He famously said, "I've seen every film ever made," which, of course, is probably a bit of a hyperbole. But he loved all those things. But his art was poetic prose, and of course, the stories, drawing from his own life and his own fears and his understanding of human nature. But his art, what he could scope, really was prose and poetic prose. A lot of it just very hard to adapt to film. And I think even he found it kind of hard to adapt to film. So there hasn't been too many very successful adaptations. But even some of his short stories started as one-act plays, I believe, and other things. I'm not sure, besides Something Wicked, I think some other things may have started first as screenplays. And Hollywood can be very seductive. And he became famous to the Hollywood people. He liked that. I think he liked being in that circle.
Yeah, and although, I mean, I've never looked into the sort of the financial side of things. What I do know is that he made a good living by selling the rights to his works to Hollywood. Even if the films were never made, he was still getting option money for those. Yeah. But once he'd got involved with a project, even if the project was cancelled or he was taken off it, he would carry on with it. I mean, you said with Nemo that essentially he wrote a script, even though you didn't think he was on the project anymore. He did the same with Moby Dick. He finished working for John Huston in 1954, came home to California, and then carried on writing the script, even though Huston was already shooting and Huston was working from his own script. So, and this happened again and again. In the 1970s, Richard Matheson had adapted The Martian Chronicles for TV, and the producers suggested that they might also make a film cut down from the miniseries. So Ray went away and wrote a script for a film version, sort of editing down Matheson's script and then rewriting it. And then the producer said, oh no, that's not what we meant. What we meant is we'll shoot it and then we'll cut it down. But he would get so drawn into these projects that even if there was no financial incentive, he would sort of have to stick with it. It's really
Ray was one of the most pure artists and pure writers that I know. That's why he was so inspirational. That's why his speeches were so inspirational, because he was a performance. You know, writing is a kind of performance. Writing is acting. It's improvisational when you're first writing it. And as you know, towards the end, his famous statement was, I wake up in the morning with all these dreams, and I regurgitate all this in the morning, write it down, and then in the afternoon I clean it up. By that he means editing and polishing. And he would edit and polish short stories for months or years before he would let his agent see it sometimes. But he was improvisational to start with, inspirational and improvisational. That's how he worked. And that comes through in his writing. That's hard to transfer to screen or even stage, but he loved the theater. So he had his own theater company for many years and produced his own plays. He said, to hell with it, if other people aren't going to produce them. So there was in North Hollywood, which is not North Hollywood, South Pasadena, which is a little city, obviously south of Pasadena. And it's a lovely place, but there was a theater there that for the last, 10 years or so, he had his own theater company and they would produce his plays, and he would be there and he would love it. He loved to see his stuff performed, because I think when he wrote it, he's performing it.
Yes.
And because he loved to write. It was his passion, it was his joy, and he wanted everybody else to feel that joy. That's why he told everybody, become a writer, just write, continue to write. I don't think he ever understood, and I don't understand those writers who say things like, oh, I hate writing. I like having written, but I hate writing. And I just don't understand that, because I was inspired by Ray because I think I'm the same kind. There's no joy in the world to me beyond writing and composing, especially in that first blush. But even polishing and even going over it and being with it and living with your own work is a consummate joy. And I think that's what he loved. And he just wanted to emanate that out to everybody else. That's why his public appearances were so popular, especially at the LA Times Book Festival, which for the first 10 years or so, I think, happened on the UCLA campus, which was where he famously would go to the library to rent the typewriters where he wrote The Fireman, the beginning of Fahrenheit 451. But it's the big hall there, I forget the name of the hall. He would be the main attraction of the LA Times Book Festival. And that hall must be 2,000 seats or more. And he'd fill it, and he'd come out, and he never had a script. He never had a speech that he wrote. It was all improvisation. A lot of it he said over and over in different speeches, but it was always fresh. It was always funny, even when he was sitting in a wheelchair. And people just, if he wanted to start, he could have been like, what's an idiot who started Scientology. If Ray wanted to start a religion, he could have. But thank goodness he didn't. But he was inspirational. He made you just want to run out of that hall and go do something creative. And that's one of his great gifts to the world. And hopefully it continues with people.
Yeah. There must be a parallel universe somewhere where L. Ron Hubbard became the great prose poet
Yeah.
and Bradbury became the religious nutter.
I hope not. I don't want to be there if so, but Ray was so inspiring. He had a great memory too. He always said he remembered his birth because he was a 10-month baby, I guess. But my wife and I saw evidence of that. We hadn't seen him for years. And one day we went to the LA Times Book Festival and we're walking around, and there's sort of a wooded area, as I remember. And we walked by and Amanda says, "Look, there's Ray." And in the middle of this, standing by a tree, was Ray all by himself. Now, I'd rarely ever seen Ray all by himself. It was usually, as your video footage showed. And so I said, well, he has his big presentation coming up. He's probably preparing. We shouldn't bother him. So we tried to quietly pass by, and he said, he looked up, and we were quite a distance. I don't know how long, but we weren't like passing right by him. And he yells out, "Amanda, Steve, that time we had together on Nemo was the happiest days of my life." So he walked up and of course talked to him. And we were, I mean, he may have said the same thing to a whole bunch of other people, but I hope not. I hope it's just something Amanda and I can hold for the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
But it was, and he did. He had this incredible memory, which I think helped his, obviously, his writing, because he wrote from memory a lot.
Absolutely, yeah. Just to go back to Ahmed and the Oblivion Machines, which you mentioned earlier, Chris Lane was one of those sort of conceptual artists involved in the Nemo project. There's a dedication in there. This is typical of Ray's books. There are little clues to how things link together, scattered through things like dedications and stuff. And for years, I would see a dedication in a book and think, I wonder who these people are that he's referring to. And then you would find out, and you think, oh, so that's who Norman Corwin is. You know, you sort of piece things together and gradually get a sense of his whole life. And in this book, which is Ahmed and the Oblivion Machines, is essentially, it's a short story.
Yeah.
He subtitles it A Fable. But on the dedication, I'll just see if I can zoom in on this a bit. So the illustrations in the book are from Chris Lane, and it says, "With love and gratitude to Chris Lane, whose imaginative sketches for Tokyo Movie Shinse's Little Nemo in Slumberland caused this book to be born." Now, the average reader picking this up wouldn't even know what Little Nemo in Slumberland was, because it was never released in that form, you know. So there's just these little clues to how things connect together, hidden away in Ray's books. And
well, that's what you do a dedication for. It's very personal.
I guess it is, yeah. I have to say that the character on the front of the book, I always thought that looked like Ray there. I think that character's got a beard, but there's something in there.
Yeah.
I think it's the goggles remind me of Ray's glasses.
Well, the character's enthusiasm, it's a horrible word I have to say. Enthusiasm is certainly Ray's.
Yeah.
I think, if I remember. It's been a while since I've read the book. Yeah, he has a big mustache too.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I don't think Ray ever tried a mustache or a beard. That'd be interesting. But Chris Lane loved working with Ray, but Ray was very, very inspired by illustrations. He loved illustrations, and he loved being involved with things that he loved. He was a font of love, and he's, as you know, love to him was the most famous, or the most wonderful thing, the most important thing.
Yeah.
Passion and love. And he was he was one of the most fortunate writers ever, I think, in American history. He didn't have a tragic life, obviously. He had dark times in his life, that some of which we know, some of which we probably will never know. But basically, he was young. I call him the first nerd or geek. He was certainly that. He got involved with the Science Fiction Society in LA and started writing. And he was mentored by Lee Brackett and Edmund Hamilton and others, but especially Lee Brackett and Edmund Hamilton seemed to have recognized that he was more than a pulp writer, that you couldn't contain him in the formula pulp stories. And even when he sold to the pulp magazines, especially we know from the research of our mutual friend John Eller and his trilogy of Bradbury biographies, which to my mind are the best biographies of Bradbury. The editors of these pulp saying, well, we love this story. Okay, we'll print this, but next time stick with our formula. You don't stick Ray Bradbury with a formula, and that's why he'll live forever, because he didn't do formula. Where the pulp writers that did formula from that era, if we read them now, we read them almost as nostalgia or just to see what, have that, like watching an old movie serial. Which I like to watch old movie serials, but they're creaky and a little bit, they were low budget, but there's some fun to be had, but they're not Casablanca and they're not The Searchers or Stagecoach or anything like that. And Casablanca was almost made as a B movie, but look what it turned out to be. So
and of course with the different casting that we've heard about over the years,
Ronald Reagan,
very different film. It just doesn't bear thinking about, does it?
It really is a horrible thought. But Ronald Reagan should have stayed an actor. There you are.
Now, earlier on, you mentioned Chuck Jones, of course, and Ray was a friend of Chuck going back many years, and they'd probably about 15 years earlier than Nemo, they'd tried to get the Halloween tree made, the film. Ray wrote a script for it, didn't get produced. I gather Chuck couldn't actually raise the finances, so Ray turned it into a novel.
That's it. Now you know why they did that. They both absolutely hated It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. Hated it. Well, Chuck for some reason didn't like Charles Schulz. I think he was quite jealous of him. Chuck tried to do a comic strip called Crawford, which ran for a couple of years, but I don't think Chuck was too admiring of Schultz's fame because it kind of maybe overshadowed his. They hated it because they thought that if you talk about a great pumpkin, you have to finally show the great pumpkin, is the way Ray always said it to me. But that's what Schultz wanted to write. The worst thing to do when you criticize a writer or think about another work is to take the attitude of, well, that's not the way I would have written it. Well, that's not the point, is it? The point is the way they would have written it. But nonetheless, they didn't care for it. And so they came up with this idea. That's Chuck in his early days. What is that, 1941, it says?
Yeah.
But Chuck he had a contract with ABC, probably at that time, or he may have still been with MGM because he made some things for MGM after leaving Warner Brothers.
Yes,
but it wasn't a typical thing that they wanted on TV at that time. It wasn't based on, even though Ray's name would maybe carry some weight, it wasn't based on a known quantity, a pre-sold concept. Chuck went on and had to do Raggedy Ann and Andy specials and go back to the Looney Tunes. His best stuff for TV was adapting Rudyard Kipling, some stories from the Jungle Book.
Yes, and I've never seen those, but I've read about.
Yeah, you should. Because Chuck always needed a writer for a longer form, not for his shorts. Although he had a writer for the shorts named Mike Maltese, but Mike, who was a Dees, Dem and Does sort of Brooklyn guy, I think, was a gag man, really. And he would feed his work to Chuck, and then Chuck would do what he called character layouts, which was actually directing the film, because he would draw the characters and all the attitude, all the acting that it needed. And he would add the dialogue. So I think most of the dialogue in all of Chuck's shorts, Chuck wrote. I'm not convinced that Mike wrote much of the dialogue, if any of it. I think he just did gags. Mike Maltese was a great guy and a great gag man and a wonderful guy. But Chuck was a sophisticated, well-read man, huge library of books, and wanted to be a fine artist. And the Depression was there, and the only job he could get was washing animation cells, which got him into the industry. And then he wound up as an animator and eventually a director.
Yeah, and he published two books that I know of that are about his life and his art. And he is a very philosophical writer. You know, his conception of the difference between Bugs and Daffy, for instance, you know, he really intellectualized the whole thing. And yet the cartoons I mean, they have an intellectual element to them, but they're also so very fluid and physical that it's hard to reconcile the idea that this is an intellectual making such physical cartoons.
I wouldn't be surprised if the intellectualism and the philosophizing came long after he made them.
Yeah, I guess.
Because he went on the lecture circuit, and Chuck was a great raconteur, a wonderful raconteur, and gave very, very funny presentations and told stories about Termite Terrace in the old days, and he hated producers. And he could be very funny. He fashioned himself, he thought of himself as Mark Twain. He loved Mark Twain, and he was obviously witty, and could be very, very funny. I got him once. We were in New York together. He had made the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner movie, which I think in England was still called The Great Chase, but it was a compilation of some of his films with new animation of Bugs being in his palatial house in Beverly Hills or something and talking about the shorts. And it was premiering at the New York Film Festival, and I was his publicist at the time. So I went with him to New York, and we're in his hotel room one day, and he says, let's take John Canemaker, who's an animation historian and animator in New York. Let's take him to the Russian Tea Room, very famous restaurant in New York. He says, so call him up and make a reservation. Make sure they know who I am. This is what celebrities do. Make sure they know who I am so we get the best table. So I call him up and make him. I said, this is for Mr. Chuck Jones. You know, he's here for the New York Film Festival, creator of Roadrunner and the Coyote and Bugs Bunny, or one of the directors of Bugs Bunny. And great, we make reservation. So we come to the Russian Tea Room. We walk in and we're greeted by the maitre d'. Mr. Chuck Jones, we love your work. This is just wonderful. We have for you, I've reserved for you Rudolf Nuryev's favorite booth. This is Rudolf Nuryev's favorite booth. And he takes us back to Rudolf Nuryev's favorite booth. And we all sit down. I must have said it 10 times. So we all sit down and we're just, maybe we're being handed our menus. And I couldn't help myself. I reach under the table and I go like this under the table. And suddenly I go, hey. And they all look at me and say, what? I said, I found Rudolf Nuryev's gum. And I don't know, I think sometimes you just didn't want to overshadow Chuck, but sometimes I could have. Because, and I was inspired by Chuck too, and his wit and the way he was. But they were great friends. Ray would often come to the office. Chuck had an office, small studio on a couple floors at the Sunset Vine building on the corner of Sunset and Vine, oddly enough, in Hollywood, which was a business building at the time, an office building. Now it's condos. It's been repurposed as condos. And at the top of the building was a wonderful restaurant called Simply Blues. And that was our watering hole. We'd go up there after work and, tipple and have some drinks and have lunch up there. And they had a great happy hour with these little like beef sliders for 25 cents or something at the time. And I was quite enamored with Chuck's assistant, Mary Roscoe. So I'd go up with her a lot and we'd have these beef sliders. And one day it's Chuck's birthday. So Chuck wanted to invite Ray. And he said, just the staff here at the office and Steve, and we'll go up to Simply Blues and we can have a little birthday. And I said, well, and Mary Roscoe said, well, okay, I'll arrange that, Chuck. And then Mary comes to me afterwards and says, Chuck said, whatever you do not have the waiters come with a birthday cake singing happy birthday to me. And I said, okay. And she said, do you think he was serious, or do you think that was a hint that he wanted them to sing happy birthday to him? I said, you're asking me? You've known him longer. I would take him at his word, because Chuck didn't kind of like doing what the hoi polloi did. You know? So, you know, she said, okay, I'll make sure they don't know that it's his birthday. So we go up there, and there was like several levels to this restaurant, as I remember. And we were kind of in a back area, long table. Chuck was at one end with his back to the rest of the restaurant and back to where the kitchen area was and all that. I think Ray was sitting on the side, probably right next to him. And then there was a staff. There was certain staff that he didn't have a huge staff on there, but there was an assistant animator and a cleanup artist, and they would be there. And then Mary Roscoe and myself. And I actually think I was sitting at the other end of the table. It was a long rectangle table. And we had a lovely lunch. And it was kind of funny because both Chuck and Ray were very used to being the center of attention. Okay, so there was sort of ping pong over who was being the center of attention, but different stories they were talking about and saying, I don't remember any. They were all stories they both probably told a million times. And we're sitting there and we had our lunch. And then towards the end of the lunch, I can see the kitchen door open in the back, and out comes a birthday cake with candles, and waiters start to join it. And suddenly they start singing from the back, happy birthday to you. And Chuck, do you know his cartoons with that dog, Mark Anthony, with the little kitten that gets on the back? And then the dog goes like that when that kitten is there. That's how Chuck went. He went like that. And Mary looks at me and starts sweating. And of course, Ray just thinks, and they come with this birthday cake. They come up the couple steps to this raised area we were, and there were other diners off to our side, and they pass by us and go to another table. And the relief on Mary Roscoe's face and the relief on Chuck's was palpable. It was crazy. But that, and then I think afterwards we privately told Ray what had gone on, and he thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. He would have loved if they'd actually brought it. If they'd actually brought it to Chuck and embarrassed Chuck. I think Ray would have thought that was very funny. Yeah, they had great admirers of each other, because Chuck again was well read, loved fiction, loved novels, very smart man. And Ray loved the Looney Tune cartoons. Ray loved to laugh. So
absolutely. Well, Steve, time has run away with us. It's 8 minutes past 5 here in the UK. I don't know what time it is where you are. 8 minutes past 9, is it?
8 minutes past 9. It's
there we
probably
go.
time for you to start thinking about some food. And I've already had my breakfast, so you know.
Well, it is time for me to stop the live stream. Steve, please stay on the Zoom meeting for a minute, and other people who are in the Zoom meeting, please stay where you are. I'm going to stop the live stream to Facebook, and then we'll just have a little private chat just to finish off. But for anybody who is watching this, I don't know, is there anybody out there? I hope there is. Thanks for watching.
Well, I see John King Carpinian is there.
I know he's joined. I think I admitted John very late to the room, but I'll have a chat with John when we go off air in a minute. Just to remind people that Bradbury 100, the audio podcast, has a new episode out today. It's a very short episode. And tomorrow there will be a new Bradbury 101 video on my YouTube channel. So there's lots of stuff out there this weekend, because, as I said at the beginning, tomorrow would have been Ray's 101st birthday. So this brings to an end this centenary year that we've been celebrating. Thanks to anyone who is watching out there, and thanks to Steve for joining me today. And yeah, see you on the podcasts. So thanks for watching, everyone, and see you again.